It was one of those nights that seemed darker than usual. The moon hung high, casting meager light on the streets of the city. But for the most part, the darkness consumed everything. I'd just started my shift as an Uber driver, and the night was still fresh. I was hoping for some simple rides. Perhaps a few tired workers returning from late shifts or young adults heading home from a night out. The ping of a new ride request sounded on my phone. The location was a quiet street on the outskirts of the city. I accepted and headed over. A few minutes later, I was parked outside a quaint little house, waiting for my passenger. The front door opened and a woman stepped out, looking slightly frantic. She quickly got into the back seat, closing the door behind her. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, her voice tinged with urgency. "I forgot my child at the park. We need to go back." I glanced at her through the rearview mirror. She was pale, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and sadness. Without asking any further questions, I input the park's location and began driving. The streets were eerily empty, and the dim streetlights did little to illuminate the way. My heart raced, a sense of unease growing with every passing moment. I could feel the woman's anxiety emanating from the back seat. As we got closer to the park, the surrounding environment took on an even more ominous atmosphere. The trees lining the streets seemed to cast twisted shadows, and the wind began to pick up, howling softly against the car. Suddenly, the woman gasped. "There, stop here." I hit the brakes, and the car came to a screeching halt. We were right beside an old, forgotten playground, its rusty swings swaying gently in the wind. The woman jumped out of the car and began frantically searching the area, calling out a child's name. Feeling a duty to help, I joined her in the search. We scoured the playground, but there was no sign of a child. The tension grew thicker with each passing second. Finally, after what felt like hours, the woman stopped and slumped onto a nearby bench, her face buried in her hands. I approached cautiously, not knowing what to say. My child. She was playing on the swings. I turned my back for just a moment, and then she was gone, she sobbed. I tried to console her. "We can call the police. They'll help." She shook her head. "No, it's my fault. I should have never left her." Just then, a gust of wind blew past us, carrying with it a faint, childlike giggle. We both stood up, our attention directed towards a corner of the playground. There, illuminated by the faint moonlight, stood a shadowy figure. It was child-sized and seemed to be looking at us. The woman gasped and began walking towards it, her arms outstretched. But as she got closer, the figure seemed to fade, vanishing into the night. The woman's desperate cries echoed through the empty playground, amplifying the harrowing despair of the situation. The rest of the night was a blur. We searched every inch of that playground but found nothing, no sign of any child or any evidence of a crime. Exhausted and distraught, I finally dropped the woman back at her home. She thanked me with a tearful whisper and disappeared into her house, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. Driving back to the city, the weight of the night's events bore down on me, causing an uneasiness that gnawed at my very core. The image of the shadowy figure in the playground, juxtaposed against the woman's haunting cries, looped continuously in my mind. I decided to make a quick stop at a 24-hour diner for some coffee, hoping to shake off the night's eeriness. As I sat at the counter, the diner's old TV played a late-night news segment. Something caught my eye. A picture of the same woman from my car, her eyes just as wide and desperate as before. Curiosity piqued, I strained to listen. The report detailed the mysterious disappearance of a little girl from the same park 5 years ago. She had been playing on the swings, and in a split second, she was gone, leaving her mother devastated. The report showcased a series of interviews with townsfolk, each emphasizing the trauma that the mother had experienced, leading her to repeatedly revisit the park, especially on the anniversary of her daughter's disappearance. Chills ran down my spine. The realization hit me like a freight train. The woman's child had been missing for 5 years. The shadowy figure, the childlike giggle, were they mere figments of our imagination, or had we glimpsed into the abyss of a mother's never-ending agony? The life of an Uber driver is usually mundane, punctuated by the occasional drunk, overly chatty passenger, or the odd tourist seeking local knowledge. But there's one night I'll never forget, a shift that seemed to stretch the bounds of reality itself. It was past midnight, the streets of the city cloaked in a dense fog, giving everything an ethereal quality. The ping from my phone startled me, a request. I accepted and made my way to the pickup point. Upon arrival, I was greeted by a young man, probably in his early 20s. He had sharp features, a clean-shaven face, and was dressed in a simple white shirt and black pants. He seemed ordinary. "Evening," he greeted as he slid into the back seat. "Thank you for picking me up." "Of course," I replied. The journey was uneventful, save for some small talk about the weather. Before long, we arrived at the address. He thanked me and exited the car. A simple ride, like any other. But as soon as he shut the door, another ping echoed through the car. The pickup point was the same place I'd just collected the young man. Figuring it was a busy spot, I made my way back. To my astonishment, waiting there was the same young man. I chalked it up to coincidence. Perhaps he forgot something at the bar or had a change of mind about going home. However, he looked slightly different. His shirt was a bit rumpled, and there was a small cut on his forehead. He climbed in, seemingly oblivious to our previous encounter. "Evening," he greeted with the same tone as before. "Thank you for picking me up." The conversation this time was different. He spoke of a recent argument with a friend and how he hoped they could mend their relationship. Dropping him off, I watched him disappear into the night, thinking how strange it was to pick up the same passenger twice. But things were about to get stranger. Another ping. Same location. I felt a mix of dread and curiosity. I decided to go back, a decision I sometimes still regret. There he was again, this time with a noticeable bruise on his cheek and his shirt torn at the shoulder. He got into the car, greeting me with the familiar "evening." He seemed even more oblivious to our previous rides. This time, he opened up about a fight he got into, presumably explaining the bruise and torn shirt. By the end of the journey, my skin was crawling with discomfort. This couldn't be a coincidence. I contemplated ending my shift, but before I could, another ping rang out. A morbid curiosity propelled me back to the same spot. The scene that greeted me was more disconcerting. The man's once white shirt was now stained with splotches of red. His face was pale, and he seemed in a daze. "Evening," he murmured, his voice weaker. Without a word, I began driving. The tension in the car was palpable. He spoke, voice trembling. "I don't know what's happening to me." "What do you mean?" I asked, even though I had my suspicions. He seemed on the verge of tears. "Every time I leave the bar, something bad happens to me. But tonight felt final." His cryptic words filled the car with a cold dread. We drove the rest of the way in silence. After he got out, I stared at the rearview mirror for a long time, half expecting to see some figure or apparition. But there was nothing. I was about to end my shift when another ping sounded. I froze. Same location. Against my better judgment, I found myself driving back. The sight that awaited me will forever be etched in my memory. The young man was now sprawled on the ground, lifeless, a pool of red around him. Panic surged through me, but before I could dial 911, a figure appeared from the shadows, standing over the body. It wasn't a ghost, but a very real, very alive person. He looked at me, eyes filled with malice, then ran off into the night. The aftermath was a blur of police sirens, flashing lights, and countless questions. The young man had been the unfortunate victim of a mugging gone wrong. The ping I received? A glitch in the app, or so they told me. I quit driving that night. The weight of what I witnessed and the inexplicable events leading up to it were too much. The city had settled into the deep quiet of the late hours when my phone pinged with a new ride request. I headed towards the pickup point and was greeted by a striking young woman, her raven black hair contrasting with a white dress. "Good evening," she greeted with a soft voice, her eyes meeting mine for just a moment before she settled in the back seat. I began driving to the destination she had entered, a place on the outskirts of town I wasn't too familiar with. We exchanged some pleasantries about the weather and the calm of the night. The car's atmosphere began to feel heavier, thick with an energy I couldn't quite place. I attributed it to fatigue until my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. The reflection staring back wasn't the young woman, but an elderly woman with deep wrinkles and wild silver hair. Her eyes were an unnerving shade of pale blue, like frost, and they stared right into mine. Startled, I almost swerved the car. Taking a deep breath, I quickly turned to look at the back seat, needing to trust my direct vision over the reflection. To my shock, it was the young woman, looking at her phone and seemingly oblivious to my reaction. I laughed to myself, trying to shake off the image. "Long night," I mumbled, thinking my tired eyes had played a trick on me. "Yes, nights can be deceiving," she replied cryptically. Every ounce of my being told me not to look in the mirror again, but curiosity won. As my eyes met the reflection, the old woman was back, and this time, she was mouthing words. It looked like she was repeating, "Help me." My heart raced. I was torn between stopping the car or continuing to the destination, which now felt like the edge of an abyss. I needed to keep my composure. "You okay, sir?" The woman's soft voice broke my trance. I nodded, trying to seem unfazed. "Just a bit tired, but we're almost there." When we arrived, the destination was an old, dilapidated house, surrounded by a fog that seemed to come out of nowhere. It looked abandoned, with shattered windows and the paint peeling off in places. The woman reached for the door handle, but before exiting, she leaned closer to the partition. "Thank you for the ride," she said, her breath cold against my neck. She got out of the car, and as I watched her walk to the house through my side window, she transformed into the old woman, her gait slow and hunched, the white dress now tattered and dirty. My heart pounded loudly in the chilling silence of the night. I fumbled to end the trip on the app, my fingers trembling. Without wasting another second, I floored the gas pedal, eager to distance myself from that cursed place. As the fog faded and the old house disappeared from view, the weight in the atmosphere lifted. To this day, I still don't know what happened on that night.